For the second year in a row, President Biden will lead the charge to increase the U.S. military defense budget. That's according to reporting from Reuters. Their sources say Biden plans to ask Congress for up to $800 billion for the Pentagon and the Department of Defense's budgets for the next fiscal year.
Second time that Biden's done it, because he's only been around twice, but that's probably the 80 trillionth time it's happened. The spending represents a huge gift, of course, to private defense contractors, according to co-founder of the Security Policy Reform Institute, Stephen Semler. Between 2002 and 2021, 55% of total Pentagon allocations ended up going to private sector firms through contracts amounting to over $7 trillion. If such a trend continues, the new budget is, quote, essentially a proposal to privatize $425 billion in public funds.
Joining us now to weigh in is great friend of the show, Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna is host of the Bad Faith podcast and The Debrief. She's also former National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign. First, tell us a little bit about The Debrief.
Oh, well, there's a fairly new app called Call-In, which is very similar to a Twitter Spaces or Clubhouse, if you're familiar with those. And it's an opportunity for me to actually talk to and engage with the people who listen to Bad Faith podcasts. So the same day a podcast is released, I go on the Call-In and talk about whatever people's feedback is on that episode and whatever else is going on in the world. And it's been great because the audience, as I'm sure you know, is really smart and substantive, and I learn a lot.
Maybe we should get on that.
Yeah, we're going to have to.
Certain
We've been
developments
banned from YouTube, so maybe we'll do that. Yeah,
Anyway.
tell us more
Yeah.
about these other platforms. I was on it with Matt Taibbi last week. I think it was my first time. It seemed kind of like Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces. What is the difference?
Well, I've never actually used those other ones, so I can't say for sure, but there are a couple of features like they just launched in-app chatting, so you don't have to just get on stage and speak to say your truth. You could also just, blog along like the way you do on YouTube. You can also very easily clip relevant parts or the best exciting parts of the episode and share them easily in 2-minute segments to social media, which is difficult because, when you're listening to an hour-long podcast, you don't always want to send it to your friend and say, hey, listen to 45 minutes of this before you get to the point of what I'm getting at. No, you can just clip it and send it, which I think will make the medium a lot more accessible to folks.
Right, you're not allowed to have a thought on a Joe Rogan podcast unless you've watched all 3 hours of it, right? That's the rules.
That's just gospel.
Yeah. So, what about this, what we're actually supposed to discuss? So I guess I don't really care if the billions are being spent privately or publicly, but I don't want the Pentagon, the government to spend this much, regardless of how it's spending it on military matter. It's absolutely fraudulent waste, but it keeps going up. And of course, right now, there will be even more, willingness among the American people to spend more money on defense, given the reality of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, even though there's absolutely no reason to think we need any sort of increase in the military spending to contend with that problem. We could reduce military spending by at 50% without even batting an eyelash,
right.
Given how, wasteful and pointless it is.
So I do think that you're right, that the overall military spending is a problem at bottom. I think that a lot of Americans are concerned that there always seems to be money readily available for military interventions and never any for domestic spending, regardless of the extent of the crisis that we're in to date. However, I also do think it's a problem that so much of the military spending is going to private sources. We've talked ad nauseum on the left about the extent to which Biden's cabinet has these figures who are former Raytheon lobbyists, et cetera. And why does that matter?
Right.
Well, I was recently told a story by an expert in this field about how during the Korean War, American soldiers were climbing into the trenches and stealing boots from Korean soldiers because theirs were so poorly made. And why? Because there were lobbyists in the United States who were advocating to spend all of this money on, planes and gear that had nothing to do with the actual war effort. And there was no big boot lobbyist that was ensuring that very crucial part of the infrastructure that was necessary to win and keep soldiers safe was actually being done. So there is also an efficacy argument that's being made here that even if we did agree, if you were someone who agreed with military spending, the fact of there being all these private interests involved directing where that spending goes and how it's done, spending it on these fighter jets that don't work, where the pilots get 15 hours of flight time a month, those things are also detrimental to our ability to effectively secure our quote unquote national interests.
Yeah, and I totally see that point and agree with it. And in fact, it's a huge problem that there's just a constituency for increasing military involvement in order to score contracts for defense companies. Which
Absolutely.
is a huge problem.
Right, and we didn't learn anything. Briahna, what you just talked about reminds me of the early days of the Iraq War, where we're spending thousands of dollars a day, per Halliburton contractor, just to kind of sit in the base, and then the actual grunts who have to leave the base are sent out in Humvees that aren't up-armored. And there were the equivalent of GoFundMes in all of these communities around the U.S. to send people flak jackets and send people helmets and to send people. So they were doing bake sales, for the infantry to have the protection that they needed against IEDs, while we're spending just obscene amounts of money on these private contractors. And to me, the problem seems to be that there's no countervailing lobbying influence. The Raytheon and Halliburton, they've got their lobbyists, and everybody's against that, but nobody's against it enough to fight against it. I mean, what's your sense of what it would take to actually get some pushback on this in Congress?
Well, what is it? Lloyd Austin, who was a former Raytheon lobbyist?
Board member. Yeah, he was on the
board.
Right,
Raytheon board member. So we have senior members of Biden's cabinet who are coming through the revolving door from these industries. And when you raised it as a concern, do you remember the pushback that we got when Biden was staffing up? It was, how dare you criticize a black man? Identity politics was leveraged as a defense against this clear conflict of interest, right? That's going to affect untold numbers of black and brown soldiers who, of course, are disproportionately represented among the armed forces for economic reasons, right? We pull our soldiers from among the disenfranchised in our country across the racial spectrum. It's a class issue. So, what would it take for people to wake up against that? I think there is a very swift pushback that comes when you stand up to the military-industrial complex. When Martin Luther King stood up against the war in Vietnam, that was where it seemed the line was drawn in the sand. That was the point at which he was finally assassinated, right? It does seem to be, and when Bernie was talking in the context of his campaign, he always seemed to understand that was going to be perhaps the biggest battle that he encountered, not necessarily advocating for Medicare for all, despite the enormous interests that were aligned against him there, but what it meant to go up against the military-industrial complex. And many have pointed out that we do have a kind of socialism in this country, but it's a socialism that is kind of administered through our military state. So many people rely on the military for jobs, for healthcare, for schools. There is an argument that part of why they don't want to cancel student loan debt is because they know that getting free college is such an inducement for folks to join the military to begin with. The same with free healthcare, right? So it's going to be an enormous uphill battle, and they will leverage arguments, identity politics arguments. They will leverage anti-patriotism arguments. I remember the atmosphere that existed in New York City where I was living when 9/11 happened, and how any criticism or questioning of our behavior as a country was looked at very suspiciously, and there was a lot of negative feedback. So it's going to take a lot of integrity and temerity from people who know better not to cow down when those familiar drums of war start to get beaten.
And to underline your point that recruiting is so much about economics and so much about class, look at what's happening right now. The military is facing a massive recruitment problem. They can't get people in the numbers they need because all of a sudden there are actually jobs available at higher wages than they used to be. I don't want to say good wages, but higher wages than they used to be. And so the quote-unquote labor shortage that is afflicting the service industry, that all the bosses are complaining about, it has trickled down into the military. And like you said, people need to be desperate. Those are the idea of free health care. They're going to get money for college. They're going to get out of their bad situation. I think that argument is really proven by the recruitment problem that they're having right now.
And you also see it in the statistics that show who is enthusiastic about war. It's a clear class divide. Those in a higher income bracket are more enthusiastic about the prospect of war. Those in a lower income bracket are not. And it's the same old age-old tale of the people who are agitating for war not being the ones whose sons and daughters are going to have to die in it.
That's a great point. Briahna, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, as always.
Up next, Kim Iverson will join us. Stick around for that.